Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. I am your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very, very accomplished individual from California, USA, Mr. Sun Yu. Sun, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Ash, and it's a privilege to be here.
Thank you. Sun is the author of a book titled Iconic Advantage, where he challenges businesses from Fortune 500 to venture-backed startups to refocus their innovation priorities. He's also got a new book releasing in March, which is titled Friction, and we'll talk a little later about this book as well. Sun has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Entrepreneur magazine, and the New York Times. Sun, what an amazing life you seem to have had and are having. So let's focus today on your book, Iconic Advantage. Tell me about the book.
Sure. So let me back up and say that I am a brand nerd, which I think you are probably too, knowing your background and what you've written about and what you're passionate about and the people that you've interviewed. And I love the idea that a brand is a living and breathing thing. And that could be a product, it could be a company, but also you talk about it can be you, right? And as with everything, just like with people, people have relationships with brands. And I was just so curious, call it the mystery of how brands are created, how they're nurtured, how they're basically supported, and how they're grown. That mystery is actually what fueled my nerdiness. And unfortunately, I've had a career not as successful as yours. I've had many, many failures in my life. And in fact, I would probably define my life as more by the epic, let's call it stops and then starts based on those stops in my life. You know, everything from I've had 5 businesses dissolved that I started. I've had to do 6 rounds of layoffs, and oftentimes with people that I've grown to love and care about that share the same mission with me. And I've had to tell them that we're not going to be able to afford your kids' tuition, let alone I'm not sure if we're going to cover payroll. So difficult conversations and over 30 product failures. And then I always talk about this. I have a scorecard of my failure, and the last number I always share is the highest one. But it's actually a very low number. It's the number 300. And in India, you may not understand this, but there's something called the credit score in the US, or maybe you guys have that too, or equivalent. 300 was my credit score. And in the US, most people have 700 or 800 as their credit score. 300 is the lowest you can go. It's the basement. And maybe 0.1 or 0.2% of the entire US population will ever reach that level. And I don't know if proud is the right word. What's the opposite of proud? I've done it not once, I've done it twice. Okay, so just so you understand the impetus and the motivation for actually writing the book was trying to understand how were great brands created. Because obviously I wasn't doing a very good job of it, Ash, so I want to know how other people were doing it, right?
Okay.
So I researched 50 great companies and really came to the conclusion that there was an intentional strategy to build brands of great distinction that had high relevance, that weren't just flashes in the pan. They were actually brands that stood the test of time. In fact, they were able to harness this distinction in such a relevant way and make it relevant not only yesterday, not only today, but tomorrow. And in this idea of creating this idea of timelessness, that they were able to achieve longevity. And having longevity for a distinctive relevance makes you oftentimes the standard bearer for that distinctive relevance. And being a standard bearer, that allows you then to achieve that level of iconicity. So I wrote about that. And probably the first thing I learned is that not only is it an intentional strategy, that these 50 companies all shared 3 things in common when they were thinking about building their iconic brand. And the 3 things are what you also write a lot about. And the first one is this idea of having something distinctive, something unique, That's something that makes you stand apart, whether it's your product, your company, or your own personal, let's say, skill set, versus the competition and versus others. The second quality is that whatever that distinction is, it is highly relevant to the audience you want to become iconic to or meaningful to. And the trick, like I talked about, is making sure that that relevance has a certain degree of longevity, so that not only is it relevant yesterday, today, but obviously relevant tomorrow. The last quality, once you've had this distinctive relevance, is to really have recognition. And the more recognition you can have, the more likely you become iconic. And recognition and iconicity can be very contextual, meaning that maybe you're just iconic in India, that's fine. Or maybe it's literally one of the neighborhoods, let's say Potrero Hill in San Francisco. I have a favorite pizza joint, and that's all they wanted to do. They wanted to be iconic in San Francisco. So their distinctive relevance was they actually have pizza that's made out of sourdough, which is a very famous, iconic, call it bread material for San Francisco. And so they're iconic in San Francisco, in Potrero Hill, and that's fantastic. So that's what I wrote a lot about. I reverse engineered what these great companies like Nike, Amazon, Google, Burberry, what they did in order to achieve that iconic status, and put it in the book. And it's been really a fun journey to share that with others, just like I'm sure you've been doing with your stuff. And I think small businesses, startups, and big Fortune 5 companies have all benefited from sort of applying these same principles. So that's basically what the book has been about.
Incredible. And I love this conversation about branding. So I'm going to ask you a few questions on branding. Given the fact that you researched so much on these 50 iconic brands or 50 large companies, I'd like to understand your perspective on what makes some brands live for 100 years and some brands which have become iconic, but they die in a few years. What is the difference, and why do some brands survive the test of time?
Okay, so what I've seen in the research is those three qualities are very critical. And the first one is this idea of, I say there's three powers that you need to be thinking about if you want to build what I consider something that has iconic advantage, advantage that's created, competitive advantage that's created by having iconic status. And the first is, do you have great noticing power? Is there something about you that makes you stand out versus other people? And if not, guess what? You're either likely to become a commodity, or you're likely to be competing on other variables that aren't necessarily related to having a good brand. Okay. So the very first thing is kind of looking at your asset base and understanding, does your brand actually stand for anything? Is there anything that makes it, rise above everybody else? Okay. Now, the trick is not just to have that, it's to actually try to embody that key point of difference or that uniqueness in what I consider signature elements. Things that are instantaneous sort of shortcuts in your brain to that point of distinction. Let me give you a few examples. Nike Air Max. What has made that successful over 35 years now is the fact that it's always had this little air pocket in the sole of the shoe. When they actually first did that product, the funny thing is it was hidden inside of the sole, so you never even could see it. And it was called the Tailwind, and it failed miserably. Okay, because part of the idea of having distinction is that people see it, recognize it, and give you credit for it, right? And so luckily, they took the technology, brought it into their, was it a think tank, the Nike sort of kitchen, whatever, right? And a guy named Tinker Hatfield, who was one of their most famous designers, basically said, look, I'm going to bring my designers in and I'm going to ask them to do two things. Make this feature and the associated benefit immediately and visibly obvious. That's number one. And number two is great thing to say to any designers, make it sexy. Okay, so that's what they did, and they launched the Air Max, and it's such a great embodiment of their key point of difference, which is this: most trainers, most shoes lose about 40% of their support in their lifetime. but a pocket of air will never lose its bounce. So it was such a powerful signature of what made them different. Other signatures, let's say in the US, there's a very famous beer, and it's our vacation beer. It's the beach beer, and it's Corona. I don't know if you ever had a Corona.
Yeah.
Okay. But its signature isn't the yellow bottle and the yellow beer inside of it. It's the lime in the neck. The lime in the neck always brings you back to I could be in Manhattan and it could be snowing, right? And on a rooftop. And as long as I pull out my Corona with the lime in the neck, I'm back on the beach in Cabo San Lucas or in Cancun or wherever it might be. Okay?
Very well said.
Yeah. I'll give you another example that's more experiential. Most companies, let's say you were to buy a flash drive and you went to your local electronics store and you brought it back home and it's overpackaged. It's in those plastic things that are, it's not even shrink wrap. They're like, I don't know what they do to it. You have to take a scissor and cut it open and then pry it open with your hands, and it's very painful, right? Well, another company said, look, my products are like treasures. And in fact, the experience of opening my product should be like opening a treasure chest. So I always ask the audience, how many people have ever bought an Apple product? And everyone, most people raise their hand in the audience. And I said, how many of you have kept the packaging? No one lowers their hand. Okay, everyone's kept, and then I go, okay, how many kept? 2, 3, 4, 5. I've gotten up to 16 packages. Okay, in an audience of less than 100 people. Yeah, that's people keep it because of the experience of unveiling the Apple product. That's a signature experience that they are able to hold. So there's all these multiple ways of creating great signatures. Now the trick is, you have to think about, how do I keep my signature fresh and current? And the second power, besides noticing power, is the second one which you're asking about, which I call staying power. Okay, it's how do you create this timeless relevance? Okay, so let's just take the Nike example. It's probably the easiest one for people to put their heads around. How have they been relevant for 30 plus years? Well, the first thing that they do is they always protect their signature elements. So no matter what iteration, no matter if they go into soccer or to golf or to tennis, whatever they go into, and no matter which generation as they evolve, you will always see some type of air pocket in that sole. Okay. Wow. And so first and foremost, they always protect the signature. But then and this is what I talk about often, it's that they don't just innovate for innovation's sake. It's where they focus their innovation. They focus it around bringing to life, making current, making it more fresh, that signature element, and the associated, call it larger order benefit it delivers. So they add innovation, they add design, and they add storytelling to those signatures. So a smart company like Nike, they think about this idea, do I have a pipeline that's focused on innovating my signature element and the benefit that's attached to it through a pipeline of great stories, a pipeline of great innovation, and a pipeline of great design. And if you add those three elements, and so that's what Nike did. If you look at every single generation of the Nike shoe, you'll see that this little idea of the air pocket, it extended into the front, and then the back, and then the front, and then they created these power balls, and then they did the entire shoe with air, and every year they kept innovating around the air technology. I don't know if you remember, there's another competitor, Reebok, and they had the pump. Do you remember the pump?
I remember the pump, yeah.
It was 2 years too late, okay? And no matter what they did, they couldn't keep up with Nike's technology. And so Nike kept innovating that key signature. The other thing Nike did is every generation, they kind of looked at what was going on in the zeitgeist, the fashion trends, and they infused that into the look and feel and design of the shoe to celebrate that key feature. And the last thing they did is they kept extending the story of where this little air pocket could go. They started off, I think it was basketball, right? And then actually it was running. And then they went to basketball. And then they went into, I can't remember, tennis. I think it was Andre Agassi, right? And then they went into a whole bunch of other categories, and they kept building the story. So this idea of taking your key signature And continually innovating around that is very critical. Now, some people tell me, well, my industry is dying and my product is dying. And so I don't, I can't do anything about that. Well, in those situations, and I work with a lot of companies that I oftentimes will say, step back. Let's not think about the confines of the product and the product category. What is the larger benefit that you represent? Okay. And how do we continue to own that benefit and move it into new executions, new technologies that still speak to that singular benefit? And I think Amazon's a good example of that.
Amazing.
I don't know. Do you want me to continue to tell you a little bit about
No,
Amazon?
no. Let me ask you, a related question. Because a large number of our viewers and listeners are startups and founders, and successful companies. They'd love to get your thoughts on what they should be doing to build their brand. And the Nike story you gave me, the Corona story you gave me, the USB story you gave me. I mean, every time I cut open a USB, I invariably end up hurting my finger because it's sort of that hard plastic, which is so, and you get angry with that. But from a startup founder's perspective, how do they institutionalize their brands?
Sure. So first, I want to just begin with the premise that most startups think is the formula for success. When I work with a lot of startups, obviously I'm in Silicon Valley, and so half my clients are startups, right? And they always begin with the premise, well, I'm going to be first. Okay, that's one. The other is, I am going to be the biggest. I'm going to have the best scale. I'm going to have the largest. I'm going to whatever. Okay. Another is, well, I'm just going to have the best innovation. I'm going to have the best bells and whistles and features, and technologically, I'm going to be the best. Okay. Those are the general premises for how people want to win as a startup. And I always say to them, here's my analogy for them to think about. I said, look, it isn't always the biggest. It isn't always the fastest. It isn't always the one with the best technology or bells and whistles. It's not the biggest, fastest, or coolest mousetrap that gets the mice. Correct. It's the one with the stinkiest cheese. Okay. So what I have them think about is, okay, don't think about the mousetrap. Think about the idea of having stinky cheese. What's your story? You could have mediocre technology, but if you can weave a better story than somebody else, and absolutely, Apple doesn't actually always have the best technology. In fact, most of the technology is third generation, right? It's already been used elsewhere, for many years, and then they come in and they kind of, package it, right? They design around it. They whatever. But I said, how do you create stinky cheese? And it goes back to this idea of the stinky cheese has to do with great noticing power and great staying power. So think about it from so that's sort of a reframe of what success is. It's not about being the biggest, fastest mousetrap. It's about having really stinky cheese. How do you create stinky cheese? Well, you don't want to just stink for stinky sake, okay? Because then it might be like, right? You want to smell like a fragrant blue cheese, or do you want to smell like, a grey? What kind of cheese do you want to smell like? Okay, that's really important. So the question then is, what's your brand DNA? And you talk a lot about this, and you have to sort of, and I looked at, I don't know how many brand pyramids, at least 30 different brand pyramids, and they tend to be over-engineered. In the book, I've kept it fairly simple. You just need to understand, first and foremost, if you think about building a pyramid in different levels, the first foundation of it is, what are your values? What do you care about? What drives you? And, it is part of your belief system. From there, it's who are you in terms of, I call it personality, but I think that gets misconstrued. It's more, what's your archetype? And when I say archetype, there's 12 known archetypes that have been used throughout history. And archetypes really speak to the role you play with others when you interact. Are you a caregiver? Are you a lover? Are you a leader? Are you a ruler? Are you a sage? What is it that you do? And then if you read the book, Heroes and Outlaws, it talks about the motivation behind those different roles. And then you look at it and say, well, what role do I play with my customers? And why do I play that role? And do I get energy from playing that role? And if you do, then that's kind of the role you play in people's lives. And that's great. So that's the second part of the DNA. And the third is in interacting with your customers or consumers or whoever you're getting money from. you're having that brand relationship, what is your promise to them? What do you promise to do if they come in contact with you and have a relationship with you?
Yeah.
And the very last thing on the pyramid I ask you is, in delivering that promise, how do you do it better, more unique, or different than other people? What's your key point of difference? Once you've articulated that, okay, the next step is, how might I embody this whole DNA, and especially the top part, the promise and the point of difference, in a signature, in something that's ownable, that every time somebody sees that, they're reminded of my key point of difference and my promise. If you can create a signature that embodies that part of your DNA, you're doing well. Okay?
What amazing advice. What amazing advice, Soon. Thank you so much. So I'm now going to move soon to your forthcoming book. But before that, I would like to mention to our viewers and listeners that Mr. Soon Yu's book, Iconic Advantage, is available on Amazon. And I'm certainly going to place an order after listening to you now. And I'm sure all of you should go and check it out. So Soon, let's now talk about your forthcoming book, Friction, in March. Tell me about this book.
Yeah, let me tell you sort of how it kind of happened. I wasn't planning on writing about the idea of friction. So as I was investigating the idea of signature elements, one of the most important signature elements for embodying your brand is signature experiences. And as I dug deeper and deeper into the world of creating great signature experience, let's take the Apple unveiling the package. The more and more I realized that the world has gone headfirst, kind of blindly into this idea we need to become frictionless and seamless, right? We basically have to be something where it's so easy you don't even think about it. Well, as I looked at experiences like unveiling the Apple product, I realized that great signature experiences are filled with lots of friction.
Correct.
And then it dawned on me, not all friction is created equal. There's bad friction, things that create redundancy, uncertainty, annoyances, frustrations. You get rid of those. But there's a lot of good friction that creates drama, it creates meaning, that creates exclusivity, that creates all these things that elicit really important happy chemicals like dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins, and adrenaline. And you cannot get those happy chemicals unless there is good friction. And so, it just dawned on me like, wow, why is the world going, we're throwing all the good friction out with the bad friction, right? The baby with the bathwater. Yeah. And I said, no. We need to take a pause and understand the distinction between both good friction and bad friction. Get rid of the bad friction. And in the clearing of all getting rid of that bad friction, we need to see what good friction is left, and we need to maintain that. But what other good friction can we add into the system? And I talk about this idea that how do you actually add value by making your customers work for it?
Okay.
Both for them and for you. And so that's what the new book talks about.
Fantastic. And you said this will be out in March.
In March.
Okay. So we'll look out for that book as well.
Yeah.
But on that note, Soon, we're now running out of time. But thank you so much for speaking to me. Thank you for talking to me about both your books, Iconic Advantage and Friction. Thank you for talking to me at such length on brands, what goes into building a brand, what is a brand DNA, and how does a startup founder also look at building some kind of iconicism, if I can say that, into their brands. Thank you again for talking to me, and good luck.
No, thank you very much, Ash. I thank you also for actually paving the way for people like myself, both with this platform, but quite frankly, you wrote about all these things way before I did. So, if anyone's going to get credit for any of my ideas, they really come from folks like you who have mentored people throughout the world. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you again. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.